I hoped the door wouldn't squeak as I carefully pulled it open, but it did. The only sound in the eerily quiet house was the refrigerator humming. I stayed still for a time, listening for any indications of life as my heart thumped in my chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was already asleep, and I could sneak into my room without his noticing. When I entered, the notion was short-lived. The light from the living room flowed into the hallway with a gentle glow. He remained conscious. I felt the burden of my error pressing down on me and my throat constricted. I arrived far later than I ought to have. It wasn't only anxiety that twisted in my stomach. There was something more, something unsaid that had been growing between us for weeks. He had been explicit about the rules, and I had broken them. I now compelled myself to move ahead, feeling as though I was getting closer to something inevitable with each step. He was seated in his customary chair, staring at me. At first, he didn't say anything or even move. Instead, he just watched me with that expression that was a combination of disappointment and something more. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something sharp that made my stomach turn. I couldn't quite place it. "Where have you been?" I lost track of time, and I hated how weak my excuse sounded. "I was out with friends," and I stammered, trying to sound casual, but the lie felt hollow in my mouth. "He knew, of course, that you were supposed to be home hours ago." His words were measured slowly, as if he was trying to maintain control, but the tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating, making it difficult for me to breathe. There was no humor in the air tonight, just this heavy-charged silence between us. My fingers twitched nervously at my side, and I could feel his eyes following every movement. He stood up, and I flinched unintentionally. He noticed that his lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "Do you think I don't care where you are or what you're doing?" he asked, taking a slow step toward me. As he drew nearer, I could feel the heat of his presence, that familiar combination of power and something more simmering within me. But I was unable to hold his stare any longer and had to look at the floor instead. I apologize for speaking in a barely heard whisper. His fingers brushed my chin, tilting my face up to meet his eyes, and I was unsure if I was apologizing for being late or for the thoughts that were going through my head. His touch was firm but gentle, and I couldn't ignore how my body reacted. I knew this was a dangerous game, and he knew it too, but neither of us seemed willing to stop. "I've let you get away with too much," he said in a low, almost whispery voice, and I realized that tonight was about something much deeper than being late. He was so near now that there was hardly any distance between us, and his quiet, controlled voice sent a chill down my spine. I gulped hard, trying to think of the proper words, but I couldn't. I didn't want to begin, but I was silenced by the expression in his eyes. He didn't care about my justifications. He repeated his tone sharply, and I didn't think I'd be worried, wondering where the hell you were. His words stung, but I couldn't deny that part of me was more drawn to the intensity in his voice than afraid of it. I felt small under his gaze, and his presence towering over me made me hyper-aware of how close we were. My heart raced, but it wasn't just from fear. I muttered, "Hey, I just lost track of time," but even I didn't believe it. I knew he didn't either. His silence told me as much. I looked down at my jumbled thoughts, which included guilt. Yes, I had crossed a line by staying out so late, but also something darker that had been lingering between us for weeks, waiting to come to the surface. He moved closer, his hand resting on the back of the chair next to me. His body hovered close to mine, and I could smell his subtle cologne aroma and feel his heat. Suddenly, my mind was a confused mass of right and wrong. I despised myself for feeling this way, even though I wasn't supposed to, not about him. His voice was lower now, but the directive was clear. "Look at me." After a little moment of hesitation, I eventually lifted my gaze to meet his. He had a stern glare, yet there was something behind it that I couldn't even identify, but I could feel it intensely. The tension between us was oppressive. I started to say something, but my voice became stuck in my throat, and I was unable to finish. Now that I was so near to him, I could feel his warm breath on my skin. My heart was thumping in my chest, but it was out of want rather than fear. How much I wanted him to stay near me, and how much I didn't want him to move away made me nervous. He froze as he extended his hand and delicately touched my arm. I was shocked by the slightest touch, and all of my nerves became hyper-aware. I should have retreated. I should have taken a step back, but I was unable to do so. I had no desire to. As his fingertips moved down my arm, sending shivers down my spine, he said, "You can't keep doing this." His tone had changed, becoming less angry and more, something else. It was a lie, yet I nodded. With him standing so near, his touch hanging on my skin, and the tension between us thick enough to pierce with a knife, I no longer knew what was better. Something that will alter everything was about to occur. His fingers moved gently down my arm to my waist, leaving a sensation that made me feel hot. Uncertain of what to do or how to feel, I tensed for a moment. My body deceived me even as my intellect cried out for me to back up and stop this before it got out of hand. He paused, his fingers softly resting on my side as if he was waiting for me to pull away to establish a barrier, but I remained still. We were silent for a while, and I realized that I had to make the decision at that point. I could have spoken out and stopped him, but I didn't. He was no longer the stern figure waiting for me to explain myself. He was something more, something I couldn't deny any longer. Before I could fully process what was happening, he leaned down, brushing his lips against mine. I took a slow, shaky breath, but I stayed where I was, rooted in place by a mix of desire and uncertainty. His grip tightened slightly, drawing me just a little closer. I could feel the warmth of his body. At first, the kiss was gentle, as if he was experimenting, but it soon intensified and became more passionate and powerful. I gasped, caught off guard by the force of it, but instead I found myself responding, my lips moving with his pace, and every sensible thought I had slipped away and was replaced by the overwhelming sensation of his mouth on mine. I melted into the kiss, instinctively reaching for him, my fingers brushing his chest. The world outside of me vanished at that moment, leaving only him, his lips, and the way my body responded to every move he made. The fear I had previously felt was gone, replaced by something far more powerful than I could have controlled, even if I had wanted to. He pulled back just enough to leave me breathless, his forehead against mine. You have no idea what you do to me. His breath was labored, and I could still feel the tension between us throbbing. His comments gave me a rush as he muttered in a low, nearly growling voice. A shock of vulnerability combined with enthusiasm. I was at a loss for words. I was uncertain about what I could say. I was drawn closer as his hand moved down and settled on the small of my back. The weight of everything unsaid between us was overwhelming, yet the closeness was exhilarating. The air felt heavy, and although I should have been afraid that I was going over a boundary that I would never be able to cross again, I didn't care at the time. I desired more. His words were little more than a whisper when his lips touched my ear. This is just the beginning. Now, without hesitancy and with confidence, his hands glided over me with purpose. The dim light softened everything around us, but the way he touched me felt electric, sharp, and undeniable. My breath hitched as his lips found mine again, hungrier this time, and I let myself get lost in the moment in the way he was pulling me closer, as though nothing else mattered. I had never imagined us like this. Not really, but now that it was happening, it felt as though every unspoken thought and every stolen glance had led to this. His hand slid under my shirt, fingertips grazing my skin, and I shivered, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity of it all. It was overwhelming, but I didn't want it to stop. I could feel the weight of him pressing against me, every movement deliberate as if he'd been waiting for this as long as I had. There was no going back, and yet I didn't want to. The tension that had simmered between us for so long was finally breaking, and in its place something far more powerful took over. I closed my eyes, giving in completely, feeling his hands explore every inch of me as I mirrored his movements. My body responding to his in a way that felt natural, instinctual. Every touch, every kiss made the rest of the world disappear until there was only him, and the way he made me feel. There was an intensity in his eyes when he looked at me, a heat that sent waves of desire crashing through me. My breath was coming more quickly. My heart was pounding, and everything else was fading away as we drew nearer. It was more than simply the physical. I sensed something deeper that I was unable to fully describe. He did, too, I knew. Everything that had been accumulating for so long, the tension, the yearning, the fear, melted away when we finally got together. As the intensity reached its peak, I felt a sense of relief, as if something inside of me had finally snapped. It was a release, but it was more than that. It was the culmination of everything that had been kept unsaid between us, and now there was no turning back. His touch was all over me, guiding me, grounding me, and I clung to him, needing him and wanting him in a way that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. Once we lay there together, his arm draped over me. With my head on his chest, the room was peaceful enough for us to breathe, and for a brief while, everything seemed to be still. However, as the intensity of the moment subsided, the reality of what had just transpired began to set in. I had no idea what this meant or what would happen next, but I did know that everything had changed as the silence descended around us. The moment's intensity subsided into a calm that was both reassuring and unnerving. I could feel his steady breathing under my cheek as his arm was lightly placed over me. From my thoughts, everything was peaceful. We crossed a boundary that neither of us had ever ventured to, and now there was no turning back. I couldn't stop repeating what had just happened, but I was no longer terrified. There was no longer any anxiety or worry about what he may say or do. It was replaced with something different, something I hadn't anticipated, a bond, a proximity I couldn't ignore, yet worry accompanied it. What was meant by this? What would come next? I looked up at him, but his eyes were closed, and his expression was calm, almost serene. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, and that only made me wonder more. My thoughts turned to the subtle but unmistakable change I felt inside myself. I no longer saw him as the authoritative figure who established and enforced rules. Instead, I sensed something deeper between us that I couldn't quite put my finger on yet. But it felt powerful, like respect or desire, but it was more complicated, and the weight of that realization weighed heavily on my chest. He stirred slightly, opening his eyes, and looked down at me for a moment, but neither of us spoke, leaving a void of unsaid thoughts. I questioned if he shared my sense of uncertainty about what might happen next. "Are you okay?" His voice was softer than I had ever heard it before, and there was only peaceful concern instead of any edge or stress. I nodded, but the reality was that I wasn't really sure. Perhaps bewildered wasn't the appropriate word, but there was also a weird feeling of harm behind it, like a weight I wasn't even aware I had been carrying had finally been removed. "I'm okay." For the first time in what seemed like forever, I felt like I could breathe, like I had some control over where things went from here. As I lay there wrapped in the silence of the room and his presence, I realized that even though nothing was resolved, I felt different, stronger, and more certain of myself, even if I wasn't sure what came next. I wasn't ready for that yet, so I didn't move, and I didn't pull away from him, but he didn't push, and he didn't press for more.